Welcome to The Lead, the New Lines magazine podcast. I'm Faisal Al Yafai, and this is a podcast where we delve into the biggest ideas, events, and personalities from around the world. As the Soviet Union broke up over 30 years ago, many of the accompanying images were triumphant. In Berlin, the wall that had separated East and West was torn down as the communities on both sides embraced. But elsewhere, the post-Soviet outlook was much less rose-tinted. In the Balkans, Yugoslavia fragmented into independent states. Bosnia and Herzegovina, following the secession of Slovenia and Croatia, voted to leave the former Yugoslavia. But the country's Serb minority tried to secede from within Bosnia and Herzegovina, sparking a bloody war that lasted until 1995, when a complex peace agreement was hatched that would keep the territorial integrity of Bosnia and Herzegovina while recognizing that the country would be made up of two autonomous sectarian entities. Now, for the first time in nearly 2 centuries, the Bosniak ethnic group, otherwise known as Bosnian Muslims, constitutes an absolute majority of Bosnia and Herzegovina's population, despite the genocide committed against them in the war of the 1990s by Serb forces. And while the EU recently agreed to begin membership negotiations with Bosnia and Herzegovina, Bosnian Serb leader Milorad Dodik has made overtures towards Russia and continues to take steps towards secession for the Serb entity of which he is president. My guest, Jasmin Mujanović, believes that much of Bosnia and Herzegovina's present issues stem from that sectarian peace agreement of 1995. In his new book, The Bosniaks, Nationhood After Genocide, he makes an impassioned case for scrapping the old system and replacing it with a liberal democracy, saying, such liberalization will place at its center the rights and dignity of the individual and equal civic rights for all citizens in all parts of Bosnia and Herzegovina, not the preservation of sectarian oligarchy. But Mujanović also believes that the future peace and prosperity of Bosnia and Herzegovina is not a matter merely for one country, but that the entire stability of southeastern Europe rests on the shoulders of the Bosniaks. Jasmin, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. Good to be here.
First of all, because this issue is so complicated, do you have issues with my introduction?
No, I thought it was actually a pretty good introduction. So kudos to you.
But you see the complexity of it, because so many parts of the story of Bosnia and Herzegovina, let alone of the wider Balkans region, is contested. The language that is used is contested, the history is contested, and it becomes incredibly difficult to try to talk about the issue when you are constantly worried about, is one group going to perceive it this way and the other group going to perceive it a different way?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. One of the perverse things that I think that's happened in kind of the broader political West over the last 10 or 15 years is that as politics in Europe and the United States and North America have become more sectarian themselves, I think some of the issues that we've been dealing with in the Western Balkans for the better part of the last 30 or 40 years have actually become more legible to people in places like the United States and elsewhere. That's obviously not to suggest that they've become as charged, but I think once you sort of begin appreciating, as for better or for worse, we've begun appreciating in places like the US and Europe, or Western Europe, I should say, questions of identity, questions of religion, questions of language, sectarian identity, so on and so forth, and how these begin to interplay into sort of ideas about who belongs and who doesn't belong in particular societies. Then I think the situation, not just in Bosnia, but the Balkans more broadly, begins to become a little bit more identifiable and understandable.
Understandable, but we still are very far away from having a concept of settled history.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, certainly that's the case in Bosnia. And I mean, for folks who have sort of perhaps come across references to Bosnia over just the last few weeks, they will probably have read about this resolution that will be introduced into the UN General Assembly, which is meant to mark the 30th anniversary of the genocide in Srebrenica. And you will then also have seen how the government of Serbia, the government of this Serb majority entity in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the Republika Srpska or the RS, they have, very vociferously opposed the resolution. They've tried to lobby other international governments. They've brought Russia to their side. It's a deeply, deeply contentious issue, at least from the perspective of sort of prevailing Serb nationalist sentiment in the region. Clearly, I mean, I think we're all kind of expecting that the resolution actually will pass and that it won't be a particularly close vote. But the fact that, I would say large segments of the international community have at least recognized the basic facts of what took place in Bosnia and Herzegovina during the 1990s without necessarily fully appreciating all the, the granular detail that I go into in this book, still nevertheless does not comport to the preferred realities and political perspectives of, again, sort of the regimes in Belgrade and Banja Luka.
Yeah, so this is the part I want to sort of make an outline for the lay audience who haven't followed the Balkans as closely as you have. And then I want us to try to dive into your argument. The geographical entity that is called Bosnia-Herzegovina, it's called a country, is split between two areas. One is known as the Federation, which is where the Bosniaks, the Bosnian Muslims, and the Croats are. And the other is known as Republika Srpska. This country is surrounded by Croatia, by Serbia, by Montenegro. But even though those borders are established, there is quite a lot of daily overlap, particularly with Serbia to the east and with Croatia to the north. And people have different passports as well.
That's right. So it's even more complex, unfortunately, than even that pretty complex description that you've given. So with the signing of this peace agreement in 1995, this Dayton peace agreement, Bosnia-Herzegovina gets internally partitioned across complex sectarian lines. So you do end up with, as you said, these two primary entities, the RS sort of towards the east and the Federation towards the west. But then the Federation itself is still further subdivided into 10 so-called cantons, most of which have either a kind of a Bosniak majority or a Croat majority, though most of the cantons are themselves actually also quite ethnically mixed. And even in the RS, something like 20% of the population, give or take, is non-Serbs, predominantly Bosniaks. And then there is still further a so-called Brčko district in the northeast of the country, which geographically splits the RS into two non-contiguous portions, which was done intentionally to actually complicate the idea of future secession attempts, which unfortunately we're seeing. And then also the actual kind of population demographics of the country don't neatly line up per se with all of these various administrative cleavages. So, everything in Bosnia is sort of often portrayed as a three-way split, as it were, between the Serbs, the Bosniaks, and the Croats. But that doesn't actually comport to the demographic realities of the country, because at least according to, the 2013 census that the country had, just over 50% of the population is ethnically Bosniak, though it's widely understood that that figure is now actually probably closer to 60%, 10, maybe less, somewhere between 8 to 12% of the population are ethnic Croats. And then Serbs are somewhere between 25 to 30% of the population. And then you have sort of a host of smaller minority communities. And also, very importantly, folks who choose not to identify with any of the ethnic communities and refer to themselves simply as citizens of Bosnia or Bosnians.
Right. Now, part of the difficulty, and this particularly to do with the Serbian population in Republika Srpska, is that they are concentrated in a broadly contiguous territory, which is along Serbia, the country. And so,
that's right.
Yeah. And so that has created, well, it's probably better if you explain what it has created, but a lot of what you and others consider to be the undermining of the government of Bosnia-Herzegovina has come from people who are within Republika Srpska and perhaps in the future hope to be much closer to the country of Serbia.
That's right. So again, I have sort of a perverse advantage right now because folks, I think, are quite familiar with sort of what Russia has done in Ukraine, not just over the last 3 or 4 years, but going now all the way back to 2014. So I would most readily kind of compare the RS to the so-called Luhansk People's Republic or the Donetsk People's Republic, right? In the early 90s, as the war in Bosnia was breaking out, the Milosevic government in Serbia sponsored and facilitated the creation of this self-declared breakaway territory that was initially called the Serb Republic of Bosnia-Herzegovina, and then eventually sort of renamed itself into just the Republika Srpska. And what the creation of the RS coincided with, or what was ultimately sort of its chief expression, was the expulsion and extermination of virtually the entire non-Serb population of the territory, which the Serb nationalist forces in the 90s had claimed. And in some cases, that meant that entire regions of Bosnia-Herzegovina in the east and northeast, which had overwhelming non-Serb majorities, were completely depopulated. All right. So you have parts of Bosnia and Herzegovina along the sort of the Drina River Valley in the east, which used to be, 80, 70, 90, sometimes even close to 100% Bosniak, which today have virtually no Bosniaks and certainly no Croats as well, although their overall number even in the early 90s was much smaller. So the RS in that sense is sort of the chief and primary expression of what we refer to as the Bosnian genocide, because it was the political vehicle for the conduct of the genocide. After 95, the entity becomes incorporated into the post-war constitutional regime of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And today it has this overwhelming Serb demographic majority, as it were, and also these very, very large, or I should say very significant autonomous powers, right? Like it's a largely self-governing region. But for the Dodik regime in the RS, that is insufficient. And so he has aspired to sort of complete the project of Serb nationalists in the 1990s, which is to say, take the RS completely out of Bosnia and Herzegovina and append it to Serbia.
So this is where the parallel with what is happening in Ukraine, as you say, the audience is probably more familiar with that. What is happening in eastern Ukraine, in this Donetsk and Luhansk region, is that ostensibly this region is meant to be independent from Russia, but because it borders Russia, there is a belief that somewhere down the line it will be absorbed into Russia proper and just be removed from Ukrainian territory. When it comes to Bosnia and Herzegovina, at the moment, there are people within Republika Srpska who are openly saying that they want to secede and no longer be parts of Bosnia and Herzegovina. But the feeling among some analysts and a lot of politicians and some of the public is that that is merely the first step, that the secession is merely a first step to an eventual integration into Serbia in the way that Donetsk and Luhansk might be integrated into Russia.
Yeah, that's right. And certainly Mr. Dodik and sort of his cohort, they've been very open about the fact that the prospective secession of the RS really is only kind of like half a step. The real aim is to append this territory to Serbia. In the 1990s, this project of combining, or I should say collecting, the entire kind of ethnic Serb population of the Western Balkans into one singular Serb-dominated state was referred to as the idea of a Greater Serbia. And the current president of Serbia, Mr. Aleksandar Vučić, was one of the chief spokespeople of that idea during the 1990s, during his tenure in something that was called the Serbian Radical Party. Today, they've kind of renamed it a little bit. So it's referred to today as the Srpski svet, which means the Serbian world, which, again, in another parallel to what's going on in Ukraine, it's directly borrowed actually from the concept of Ruski mir, the Russian world. So unfortunately, we're witnessing a kind of, a mixing and remixing of history, both current and from the recent past in terms of what happened in the Balkans in the 1990s. And unfortunately, also what we're seeing in the present again in Russia and Ukraine.
So in a moment, I want us to move from the politics of the moment to talk about your book, which is taking a much broader view of the Bosniak population, the Bosnian Muslim population, part of the difficulty and also the beauty of Bosnia and Herzegovina, that even though they have been, that there's a tendency to try to put them in these boxes, part of what you are trying to do in the book is bring to the fore the full flowering of identities within that community, within that country. So we'll come to a lot of that. But before we get to that, I just want to finish the politics of the moment part. And the politics of the moment, as it pertains to your views, are that the difficulty with the current setup in Bosnia and Herzegovina is that you have what is objectively a small country of 3 million people, and yet it has one of the most complicated political regimes anywhere in the world. Something
That's right.
Well, you can explain more about it, but that political regime is it's divided along ethnic lines, but then it gives veto rights to different people. There are different parliaments. There are different presidents. I mean, you can pick up the story.
That's right. Yeah. So the short version is that, Bosnia and Herzegovina is a country approximately the size of Wales or West Virginia, if you're based in the US. It has a population officially of 3.5 million people, though most estimates actually put the real population at under 3 million at this point. And yet virtually every single government office and administrative region in the country is divided on the basis of ethnicity. So the country has something like 14 different prime ministers, a 3-member rotating presidency, which again is divided along ethnic lines. And then also on top of all of that sort of ethnic division, there's a large host of Bosnian citizens who are actually barred from meaningful political representation because they do not identify with any of the 3 so-called constituent peoples, which are the Bosniaks, Serbs, and Croats. So, for instance, one of the most pressing issues in Bosnia and Herzegovina that I devote a significant amount of time in the book to are these outstanding cases, or rather outstanding decisions by the European Court of Human Rights, of which there's been about half a dozen at this point, all of which have sort of struck down large segments of the Bosnian constitution on the basis of the fact that it essentially reserves all political power and right to representation in the country to these 3 constituent groups. So if you happen to be, for instance, a member of Bosnia and Herzegovina's historic Jewish community, or its Romani community, or its Italian community, or its Ukrainian community, actually, or for instance, God forbid your parents were not from the same ethnic group. So maybe your mama was, a Bosniak and your dad was a Serb, and you say to yourself, okay, well, I'm just a Bosnian because I'm not really either one of these things. You can't, for instance, be in the presidency. You cannot be a member of the Bosnian presidency and say that I am a Bosnian. You will be constitutionally barred. And so this is one of the great kind of contradictions and absurdities of this current system. And moreover, in a sense, kind of the primary contention of this book, or one of the primary contentions about the book vis-a-vis this whole kind of ethnic paradigm, is that rather than actually having facilitated peace and reconciliation and having actually led to power sharing, as political scientists would want to say, by making all political power and all rights to representation contingent on the idea of ethno-sectarian identity, this regime has actually incentivized a very kind of binary and zero-sum and very conflictual form of politics, which has actually kept the country sort of frozen in a perpetual state of kind of semi-conflict.
And this is where this phrase stableocracy comes from, this idea that actually so much of the energy of the external players, the international community, has been expended on merely keeping Bosnia where it is, just in this kind of fictional idea of stability. And of course, this is why we were talking about recent news. Bosnia and Herzegovina is trying to enter the EU.
That's right. Yeah, it's trying to enter the EU. It's trying to enter NATO, as are other countries in the region. But, in some case or in some way, Bosnia and Herzegovina's path to the EU is perhaps the most symbolically laden, because in the context of the Yugoslav dissolution and the Yugoslav wars, for that entire decade of violence and war and horror, something like 140 to 150,000 people were killed. Of those, 100,000 were killed just in Bosnia. So the Bosnian War was far and away the most destructive, deadly, and violent of all of the Yugoslav wars. It certainly saw, unfortunately, the worst atrocities committed almost wholly, if not exclusively, by Serb nationalist forces against the Bosniak community. And so the idea of actually getting Bosnia into the EU in some ways is the proof of concept of the ability of the EU to really deliver lasting political change through the enlargement process, right? If you can get Bosnia in, then you actually have a credible argument to make towards countries like Ukraine, for instance, which hopefully in a few years' time, once it is at peace, will also be pursuing a similar track as Bosnia has. But to date, that path towards the EU has proven to be very, very difficult, very, very fraught. And again, my sort of contention is that the ultimate reason for that, or rather the kind of the structural reason for that, is the dysfunction embedded into the country as a result of this constitution.
And to be clear, you don't have a problem with the idea of Bosnia entering the EU at a certain point in the future. Your concern is that if it enters with this current political setup, all you will do is freeze all of these issues into the foreseeable future, now within the context of the European Union.
That's one version. I think my actual fear is perhaps simpler than that, which is to say that Bosnia and Herzegovina cannot join the EU with this current constitution. It doesn't abide by the actual rules and norms of the EU acquis, which again, the European Court of Human Rights has said, both in terms of the European Convention on Human Rights, and then also more broadly with the sort of tutto completo concept of the EU legal order. So Bosnia, as it is currently set up, despite all the sort of pronouncements of European and American officials, cannot join the EU as it is. Everyone knows that. Most are willing to sort of sheepishly acknowledge that, but they don't want to then talk about the logical consequence of that realization, which is that the overriding and most important issue in Bosnia and Herzegovina's political future trajectory, and ultimately also its political present, is the question of constitutional reform. Because until you have a functional, representative, constitutional, democratic regime in this country, Bosnia will not actually be able to make meaningful steps towards the EU. And the sort of recent changes that have taken place in terms of the EU greenlighting candidacy and the start of negotiations, everyone, both in Sarajevo and Brussels, is completely aware of the fact that that was a huge gift. That was a gimme. That was not based on any meaningful transformation or reform that had happened in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And it arguably had to do more with sort of geopolitical reasons that are rooted in, again, Russia's aggression against Ukraine, than unfortunately with any meaningful reform processes that were taking place, or rather not taking place, in Bosnia.
Okay, let's get to the book. Now, tell me first of all why you felt the need to write the book defining this community and looking at its history.
I think the chief reason was, I'm someone who writes about the Balkans a lot, and it's my primary area of concern. And, I'd written a previous book about sort of what had happened to the broader project of democratization in the Western Balkans. And as I had sort of increasingly begun working more on issues related to the memorialization and commemoration of the genocide in Bosnia, and the rise in revisionist currents and negationist currents, and how, for instance, aspects of Serb nationalist discourse and sort of their various ideological hobby horses had increasingly begun being incorporated into Western far-right discourses, in particular sort of against Muslims and refugees and others. I really began thinking more and more about what was at the heart of all of these dynamics, and I came to the conclusion that for me the key issue was that the very idea of Bosniak national identity was actually very, very poorly understood, in particular in the West, but also honestly to some extent in Bosnia, which is actually to say that there's still very much a current and ongoing debate about how the Bosniak community should self-identify. What is their relationship to Bosnia? What is their relationship to other communities in Bosnia and in the Western Balkans? And I thought it was, in some ways, it was necessary to hash out what are some fairly basic questions about, this group's self-identity and its recent history, but also at the same time really categorical to the future of Bosnia, which I again believe is this very, very strategically significant policy in the whole of the Western Balkans, and thus the whole of Southeastern Europe, because the Bosnian community very clearly demographically are not just on their way to becoming the majority, which they already are of BIH, but actually on their way to sort of becoming the super majority of the Bosnian population.
So let's talk then about the Bosniak identity and what it means to be or to identify as a Bosniak. Mm-hmm. You spend a considerable time in the book discussing the importance of Islam to the Bosniak identity, noting how, while many Bosniaks might consider themselves Muslim, it is not the defining feature of their Bosniak identity.
Right. So I guess the simplest way to explain what my kind of contention is vis-a-vis Bosniak national identity is that I reject this idea or this term Bosnian Muslim, which continues to be quite popular in the political West and to some extent in the Western Balkans, though it should be said in the context of the Balkans, it has sort of increasingly become seen as something, not quite a slur, but a kind of belittling term.
Just explain for the audience why that is seen as a belittling term, because from the outside,
sure,
people would say, well, there's a country called Bosnia, and within it, there's a bunch of different identities, one of which is being a Bosnian Muslim. There are Bosnian Christians.
That's right. That's right. There are Bosnian Christians, although the term Bosnian Christian is almost never used. Instead, as was evident, for instance, during the 1990s, during the war, the sort of standard definition of the conflict was that on the one hand, you have Bosnian Serbs, Bosnian Croats on the other, and then you have Bosnian Muslims. And the obvious problem with this categorization is that here we're using two ethnic labels, and then for the third group, we're using a religious marker. And it also suggests that identity for this community is synonymous with religiosity, which for large segments of the Bosniak community, including myself, is problematic because there are huge segments of the community which are secular and atheist. I often make the observation that I'm a fourth generation atheist. The number of mosques I've been in my life is I can count on one hand, and it was usually by accident. And so Islam, in this sense, it is a very important aspect of Bosniak national identity, but it is by and large a cultural marker. And it also then erases what actually is the most significant aspect of Bosniak national identity, which is their categorical belief that they are an indigenous Bosnian people and that Bosnia and Herzegovina is their only national homeland.
Yeah. And so, again, we have to explain to the audience why that matters in the context of the Western Balkans.
Sure.
Because one of the arguments that is often made in the Western Balkans about the presence of Muslim communities, the two major ones being the Bosnians and the Albanians, is, well, you explain it, but there's an argument that is often made about the presence of these Muslims in that region.
That's right. So the obvious sort of claim that is made both by European reactionaries and local reactionaries is that the fact of predominant Muslim identity among Bosniaks and Albanians in the Western Balkans actually makes them an alien people to the Balkans, i.e. that they are not actually of the Balkans, that they are in most cases identified as being Turks. And in fact, the term Turk is an actual slur that is used in the Western Balkans primarily by Serb nationalists against the Bosniak community. You would refer to someone as a Turk to suggest you are not of this place, you are alien, you are Oriental, you are foreign, and so you need to be excised from this land, from its history, from its politics, much as the Ottoman Empire in their narrative was excised over the course of the 19th and early 20th century.
And in both cases, with regard to the Bosniaks and the Albanians, both communities make the same counter argument, which is that they say you are focusing too much on the religion and not enough on the ethnic identity. Is that what you'd call it?
Yeah, and also just the fact of their historical presence. I mean, there is no question about the fact, for instance, that the Bosnian community are a Slavic community, among other things, right? So they are, if we can use the term ethnically Slavic, they speak a Slavic language. The DNA data tells us that they are a indigenous Bosnian and Southeastern European community. There is no meaningful evidence of, it being an ethnic group that has a significant, DNA marker that would place it as having originated in some place like, the Middle East or North Africa or wherever else. So It is very clearly an indigenous community. And for the Bosnian community, then what becomes very, very important is laying claim to that idea of Bosnian indigeneity as the crux, and indeed as the very center of their political and ethnic identity.
And interestingly, you think that the difficulties that the Bosnian community has had with proving this indigeneity is something that is reflective of a wider anti-Muslim context. So you note in the book that allies of the Clinton administration in the 1990s considered an independent Bosnia to be, this was their quote, unnatural as the only Muslim nation in Europe. And even Kissinger at the time argued that there was no such thing as a Bosnian culture and that the country would have been just an administrative entity. And you see those arguments as being part of a wider anti-Muslim argument. And that is why when people look at the Bosniak community, they focus primarily on the religious aspect and not the ethnic aspect.
That's right. I mean, so on the one hand, I think it's not difficult to prove it all, and I think the book does. So obviously there was a very significant degree of anti-Muslim animus that animated the lack of Western support for Bosnia and Herzegovina and the Bosnian community and the sort of Bosnian independence cause during the 1990s. And to some extent, it's also continued to very much inform some of the debates, in particular in Europe, about Bosnia-Herzegovina. You know, people like Viktor Orban are very upfront about their Islamophobic stances, and that for them, Bosnia-Herzegovina is very much a problem because it is a predominantly Muslim country. But then at the same time, the flip side of that is that this ignores what the actual lived experience of Islam and Muslimness in Bosnia-Herzegovina actually is, which is to say that there are these very essentialist and deeply problematic views of what it means to be Muslim, what it means to have an Islamic society in large segments of the political West, which, you know, in their mind make it essentially synonymous with something like, you know, hardline Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia, or even, you know, some of the horrors that we saw during the so-called Islamic State. Whereas in reality, the actual lived practice of Islam in Bosnia-Herzegovina is deeply secular. It is very, very moderate. And, you know, I go through a litany of sort of small, but I think illustrative examples in the book. For instance, the fact that the vast majority of self-identifying Muslims in Bosnia-Herzegovina drink, you know, their interpretation of Islam and sort of the five pillars, as it were, is very loosey-goosey, let's just say. There's certainly very little indication that an at all significant portion of the Muslim population in Bosnia-Herzegovina, for instance, prays 5 times a day. For instance, one of the oldest mosques in Sarajevo, a 16th century mosque, is literally across the street from a strip club. And so Islam in Bosnia-Herzegovina, to my mind, and I think to the minds of most who have studied the subject, much more resembles what has happened with Christianity in the rest of Europe, i.e. that it has become deeply secularized, that it has become largely a cultural marker rather than necessarily a religious practice per se. That is sort of what is true of Islam in Bosnia-Herzegovina today, which, however, should not be interpreted to say that Bosniaks do not identify as Muslims. They do overwhelmingly. It's just that what they understand to be Muslim and what they understand to be Islam is not generally what people in places like France or the United States assume of the religion or identify with the religion and the idea of being a Muslim.
And why do you think European countries have such difficulty with these Muslim majority countries? It was only 2, but these Muslim majority countries.
I mean, I think the simplest answer is, even if we don't want to sort of ascribe any particular kind of, shall we say, reactionary or bigoted views to the majority of the, you know, the populations in these countries like France and whatever, Denmark and Netherlands, et cetera. I think there is just an overwhelming belief that Islam and Muslims are somehow alien to Europe, much as there's a belief that, you know, people of color more generally are alien and foreign to Europe. Neither of which, incidentally, is true, right?
Yeah,
Black and brown people have been part of European history for as long as European history has existed, and Islam and Muslims have likewise been present in Europe even longer than the arrival of the Ottoman Empire in Southeastern Europe and the subsequent process of large-scale conversion that occurred not just in Bosnia-Herzegovina and Albania, but actually many other parts of Southeastern Europe, which is one of the sort of the other kind of, shall we say, significant footnotes that this book wants to bring to the fore. And it's certainly not the only book that discusses this, but I do think it's important in this context, which is to say that there was significantly larger communities of Muslims throughout Southeastern Europe well into the 20th century. But they disappeared, and they disappeared through processes of ethnic cleansing and expulsion and sort of ethnic rehomogenization, which also then ultimately came to leave an indelible and catastrophic mark on Europe in the 1930s and 1940s through the Holocaust. And I think in some ways the Holocaust is the final expression of a process that begins in parts of Eastern and Southeastern Europe over part of the late part of the 19th century and into the early part of the 20th century, which in some cases initially all targeted first and foremost Muslims, but then also Jewish communities as well.
And some of the things that I thought, I mean, that come out in the process of reading your book is that you accept the immense complexity of the Bosniak community throughout history. You don't, for example, try to fit it into what we might think of as the current narratives. So you talk, for example, about how the dynasty that originally founded Bosnia was Christian, the Kotromanic dynasty. And then you talk later about the Bosniaks and how they have this complicated relationship with the Ottomans. So you're not trying to downplay the complexity of it. You're actually trying to put it into the context of historical narratives, not modern day narratives.
That's right. And you touch on two, I think, really, really important parts of the story, which is this relationship with the medieval Bosnian kingdom and the Kotromanic dynasty, and then also then the arrival of the Ottomans. And so, I know they say you shouldn't judge a book by its cover, but in this case, my choice of the cover was very pointed, which is to say that, it features this emblem, which became the emblem of the coat of arms of the Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina during the 1990s. And that emblem is a stylized version of the coat of arms of the Kotromanic dynasty, and it features these 6 lilies. Now, the thing that I always point out is that this symbol of the lilies has now become sort of seen as the national marker of the Bosniak community. It's become synonymous with the community. And what's really striking, of course, about anyone who knows anything about heraldry is that the lily is very much a stylized cross, right? Everyone should kind of know this. And certainly there's no illusion among the Bosniak community, which is overwhelmingly Muslim, that their national symbol is a stylized cross, because the Kotromanic dynasty was a self-identifying Christian dynasty. And what's significant about the adoption of the lilies and the Kotromanic coat of arms is that what the Bosniak community is saying and began saying in the 1990s is that, look, our relationship is with Bosnia. It is not with Islam. Yes, we are devout Muslims, and yes, we honor our Islamic faith, and it is important to us. But the thing that actually gives us our core identity is the relationship with Bosnia and Herzegovina and the history of Bosnia and Herzegovina as a state and as a sovereign entity. What matters to us in this context, first and foremost, is the political and historical integrity of Bosnia and Herzegovina. So that relationship with Bosnia, I argue, is actually the defining quality of the Bosniak community, even more so than the community's Muslim identity.
And you spend a lot of the book talking about this evolution and the growth of Bosniak nationalism. I want us to come now back up to date. You talk about what is happening right now in the country, and you suggest that Bosniak national politics shouldn't be concerned with the creation of a Bosniak nation state, an ethno-nationalist state, but rather with a liberal democratic polity. That's the argument that ends your book.
That's right, because there's a number of reasons for that, some of which I think are quite self-serving and strategic, shall we say, and others which I think just simply better articulate what has been the lived experience of the Bosniak community. One of the themes that I return to time and again in the book is the idea that while Bosniaks are a majority, certainly now in Bosnia and Herzegovina, regionally they are still a minority, right? Muslims are, and Bosniaks are a minority in Southeastern Europe. They are surrounded by much larger ethnic and religious communities. And so the idea of entering a conflict with other peoples in Bosnia and Herzegovina in the attempt to create a Bosniak nation state, to me, seems preposterous and self-destructive on the face of it. On the other hand, the idea of kind of a homogeneous vision of Bosnia and Herzegovina, in any sense, that has never been the lived reality of Bosnia and Herzegovina, right? Attempts at homogenization of Bosnia, which occurred, for instance, by the Croatian fascist puppet regime in the 1940s or the Serb nationalist regime in the 1990s, have always necessarily featured tremendous amounts of violence, because there is no way to unmix the Bosnian peoples except through violence. And so, to my mind, the idea of kind of an exclusionary Bosniak nationalism or a Bosniak national politics is also antithetical to what the Bosniak community's own history and own political sort of directions have shown themselves to be successful, shown themselves to be their actual commitments, right? So as I illustrate in the book, when you actually look at voting patterns, for instance, in Bosnia and Herzegovina since the war, far and away the most moderate and progressive and liberal community in the country are the Bosniak community. Their ideological and political principles are actually the ones that are most in line with, shall we say, this European project. And in a sense, the thing that would most readily articulate a true realization of Bosniak national politics would not actually be the transformation of Bosnia and Herzegovina into something that I think would be quite ahistorical, which is the idea of a Bosniak nation state, but rather a multi-ethnic Bosnia with equal rights for all its citizens. And that ultimately simply means the implementation of the decisions of the European Court of Human Rights and bringing the country's constitution in line with the European Convention of Human Rights.
It seemed to me reading the book that often when you were talking about the construction of this liberal democratic state, you were writing in opposition to some other ideas. And those other ideas include the continuation of the current status quo, which you don't like. They include, obviously, this idea of Republika Srpska seceding and perhaps in the future becoming part of Serbia. Mm-hmm. But you were also writing against the idea, which has become current among some parts of the Bosniak population, that says we do need an ethno-nationalist state, that instead of having this extra Serbian-Croat element to it, let's just have our own ethno-nationalist state, whatever it might be called. And it seems that you were writing against all of those versions of a future for Bosnia.
That's right. Because, again, I find it difficult to imagine that any kind of homogeneic vision, a homogeneous project could ever succeed, not just in Bosnia, but really in any part of the Balkans, that would not necessarily either trigger or actually require violence. And so I am very wary of anyone who, looks at the actual demographic and historical realities of the Balkans and says, oh, what we need here is like a ethnic enclave. And also, on a kind of deeply personal level, I find it abhorrent that we would move towards a political regime that would erase so many people from the story of Bosnia and Herzegovina, not just obviously other sort of ethnic communities, Serbs and Croats and others, but just the fact that, famously, right, prior to the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, something like a third of all marriages in Bosnia and Herzegovina were ethnically mixed. And even today, although those rates have fallen off sharply, you would be hard pressed to find anyone in Bosnia and Herzegovina who does not have some kind of cohabitation, ethnic cohabitation within their own family history. So, why would we at all pursue a politics that does not comport to the lived organic realities that have always been true of Bosnia and Herzegovina? This to me seems like a completely warped project to pursue.
One difficulty with your liberal democratic polity will be explaining that and persuading the other minorities in the midst, because as you say,
that's right,
Bosniaks are now the majority. And you write that in complex multi-ethnic societies, sectarian-based models of governance only perpetuate discrimination and ultimately incentivize violence. Having lived in Lebanon, I know how problematic sectarian-based models of governance can be, but equally how difficult it is to convince members of minority groups that are invested in that system to divest from it. After all, in the Bosnian context, within living memory, members of Bosnia and Herzegovina's minority groups have suffered ethnic violence at the hands of the Bosniaks. How do you then convince them that this more liberalized system you're advocating won't simply benefit one group, the majority group, the Bosniaks, to their own disadvantage?
It's a very, very good question. And the answer that I try to offer in the book is twofold. One, I actually make the argument for really doubling down on the idea of minority rights and cementing minority rights through legal and political mechanisms that can actually survive legal challenges. So the current regime as it is set up, as I've pointed out, has sort of been repeatedly struck down at the European Court of Human Rights, which is a very significant international legal institution because the Bosnian constitution itself says that the decisions of the European Court of Human Rights actually take precedence over domestic law. So it's not just the kind of, nice little summit of hippies that said, ethnic discrimination bad. This is actually a very, very important legal institution. So if you are somebody who's actually interested in the position, for instance, of Bosnian Croats and protecting their ethnic and communal rights, then it is in your interest to move towards a model that is legally and politically viable, right? And that is ultimately going to be in line with the European Convention on Human Rights. That's number one. Number two is that the political and demographic realities in Bosnia and Herzegovina are headed in the wrong direction from the perspective of those who are invested in maintaining some version of the current system. Because Bosnia and Herzegovina is becoming overwhelmingly Bosniak. It's very likely that within the next 10 to 20 years, the country will be not just around 60% Bosniak, it will probably be well above 60% Bosniak, which is going to become a serious issue if you still have this sectarian political regime, because there is no amount of ethnic gerrymandering that you can engage in when the ethnic demographics are going to become so skewed. And so rather than create a situation where, opportunistic ethnic entrepreneurs, as they're sometimes called, including those within the Bosniak community, would essentially seek to hijack this political system once the numbers are sort of sufficiently in their favor. My argument is actually, no, now is the moment that you need to see the writing on the wall and move towards a liberal democratic regime, because that is what is going to ultimately prove not just to provide more security for minority communities in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but ultimately will actually increase their rights to representation. I mean, the easiest way to, for instance, illustrate this is I mentioned earlier this notion of these constituent groups in Bosnia and Herzegovina, these constituent peoples as they're referred to in the constitution. And this is a core constitutional concept in Bosnia, this idea of constituent peoples, and that there should be essentially parity between the constituent peoples, except the term is nowhere defined. Nowhere in the Bosnian constitution or any of its other subnational constitutions is this term defined. And it's one of the reasons why, for instance, the European Court of Human Rights has found it so easy to strike down aspects of the Bosnian constitution, because they are so shoddily written and justified under the current regime. And so my argument is that actually, no, if we are serious about minority rights, if we're serious about civic equality, we need to move towards a more liberal model, not a still more restrictive sectarian one.
To take the perspective of these minorities in a future majority Bosniak state, you're asking them to put their faith not in their own communities, but in the legal system. And you're asking them to the political system, and you're asking them to do so in the context of a region that has suffered immense violence, the worst violence on European soil up until the invasion of Ukraine. That's quite a hard sell for these minority communities.
You can certainly take that view if you just kind of put Bosnia and Herzegovina under a microscope and decontextualize everything that's happened over the last 30 or 40 years. The flip side of the argument is that large numbers, the largest numbers of Bosnians from all communities have already voted for these systems. They have already voted for these regimes because they have en masse moved themselves and their families to societies in which they are minorities under liberal democratic regimes from Germany, the Netherlands, Ireland, Sweden, Canada, et cetera, where they have no guaranteed political representation other than as citizens and participants in a kind of broad-based, open, liberal democratic regime. And so already they have sort of abided by the core arguments that, yeah, we're actually fine with this. And we will do so ourselves voluntarily, even if you essentially deny it to us here. That's one argument. The other argument is to say that, look, actually, no, it's not about putting your trust in anyone else's hands. It's about ensuring the best outcome for your political community. If you want to ensure a permanent sense of functional and durable political representation for your community, i.e. the Croats or the Serbs, if you want to actually permanently embed your community and your identity, shall we say, within the prism, the mosaic of Bosnia and Herzegovina, then that needs to be done in durable fashion. A regime that foments resentment and that foments conflict, as the current system has done, is by definition not durable. So there is a better degree of representation and protection that is available to you if you are willing to meaningfully engage in the conversation, right? That's the argument. And there's certainly no singular model of multi-ethnic liberal democracy that I prescribe or that I think should be prescribed. There's a whole host of potential examples. Some are a little bit more, shall we say, restrictive as far as the ethnic question is concerned. Others are more liberal. We have everything from Canada to South Africa to India, et cetera, on and on down the list we go. And so there are far, far more complex societies that have been successful in transitioning towards much more open and liberal political regimes than Bosnia. And there is no reason why this country in Europe, ensconced by EU member states, by NATO member states, which already supposedly has a European perspective and has already pledged itself to do exactly what I'm suggesting it should do, can't actually, shall we say, finally go ahead and do it.
You've been following this story, these details, for a very long period of time. And you have lived through multiple contexts in which suddenly the Balkan question is important to the Europeans and suddenly it's not, and so on. And now, of course, we're in a particular moment where it seems like a lot of attention is focused on what's happening in Ukraine and not so much on what's happening in the Western Balkans. I wonder how you feel. Do you feel optimistic that Bosnia and Herzegovina can chart a path to a better future? Do you feel like the political moment for that mass change has passed or is still coming?
I think it's still coming. I mean, I define my view on Bosnia, and I think the Balkans as a whole, actually, by saying that long term, the region is headed absolutely in the right direction. Short term, there is the high prospect of significant instability. And what I mean by that is that I think the political and social pressure for the liberalization and democratization of Bosnia and Herzegovina's constitutional regime is going to become overwhelming. In some ways, it has already reached a real crescendo. And I sort of explain or give examples of that throughout the book. But I think it's very, very clear in some ways that the sort of intellectual normative battle has already been won. It's now a question of actually putting those normative and ideological commitments to liberalization and democratization into action. Now, that is obviously much, much easier said than done, but we've already charted a very, very significant course as it is. That having been said, one of the things that does worry me is that there is always this desire and a very, very strong appetite by Western officials and Western diplomats to sort of pursue the path of least resistance when it comes to these kinds of societies, in which I unfortunately now also have to include Ukraine. And so in Ukraine, for instance, we're seeing what I consider to be very failed models being kind of floated repeatedly. Anytime there is any kind of discussion about peace in Ukraine, you'll actually get some version of this Dayton model being floated as some kind of solution for Ukraine. And what I'm always at pains to point out, not just obviously to my friends in Ukraine, who I think are very critical and wary of such a model for understandable reasons, but actually to their European and Western interlocutors, which is that I don't think Europe and the Atlantic community can afford what I refer to as a nuclear Dayton, right? I don't think you can have a Dayton-style scheme for Ukraine when you have Russia, a nuclear-armed Putin-esque Russia. It hasn't worked with normalizing and moderating political views in Serbia. It's certainly not going to work with Russia. That's I think the sort of one major problem. The other one is that I think, if we turn, for instance, to Kosovo, which is another kind of quote unquote problem state in Europe, we're seeing the US in particular, but also the EU attempting to force the Kosovo government to impose a version of this kind of Dayton ethnic political partition scheme through something that they're referring to as the Association of Serbian Municipalities in Kosovo. And as I keep pointing out to my American and European friends, we know this doesn't work. We know this will be struck down by the European Court of Human Rights. Why would we pursue a failed political regimen when there are alternatives available, not just alternatives in the abstract, but the alternatives that you yourselves have based your entire political regimes on? Why is it that when you come to the Balkans, you offer us 19th century imperial partition schemes, but then tell us that actually what you want us to do is to join the community of European democracies? Why do you not help us build those European-style democracies from day one, rather than sort of, tying these bricks around our feet and then tossing us in the river and saying, boy, you guys certainly seem to have a hard time getting along?
Jasmin Mujanović, thank you very much.
Thank you.
This has been The Lead from New Lines Magazine. You can find Jasmin Mujanović on Twitter at YasminMUJ. His book, The Bosniaks, Nationhood After Genocide, is published by Hearst and available online or at all good bookstores. This week's episode was produced by Finbar Anderson and hosted by me, Faisal Al Yafai. For more like this, subscribe to The Lead on your favorite podcast app or visit our website, newlinesmag.com. If you enjoyed this week's episode, please rate us and leave a review, as it helps us to grow our audience. And thank you all for joining us.